In 1889, a man collapsed in the streets of Turin, arms wrapped around a horse that a driver was beating. He never spoke a coherent sentence again. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and the philosophy he built before that collapse is the exact blueprint for why an entire generation stopped feeling. You've heard people call this generation cold, detached, numb, ruthless, able to end a friendship, a relationship, a job with one word and zero guilt. Older generations call it a personality defect. Maybe you've called it that about yourself. It isn't a defect, it's a philosophy. One sick, half-blind German wrote it down 140 years before you were born. And by the end of this video, you won't see yourself the same way again. Before we get to him, look at the numbers, not vibes, numbers. In 2018, the healthcare company Cigna ran the largest loneliness study ever conducted in America. Over 20,000 adults scored on the same clinical scale doctors use to measure isolation. Gen Z scored 48.3, highest of any living generation. Higher than millennials, higher than boomers who lived through actual wars. A year later, the follow-up found 79% of Gen Z calling themselves lonely, against 50% of boomers. Now sit with the contradiction. This is the most connected generation in human history. A phone in every pocket, a group chat for everything. And it is also, by clinical measurement, the loneliest generation this country has ever recorded. Cold, isolated, and somehow accused of feeling nothing at all. That's not a contradiction. One man explained the mechanism behind it before your grandparents were born. Friedrich Nietzsche, born October 15, 1844, in a small Prussian town. His father, a pastor, died when he was 4. He became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at 24, the youngest in the university's history. Then his body turned on him, migraines that blinded him for days, a stomach that rejected almost everything he ate. By 1879, he resigned. He spent the next decade alone, in cheap rooms across Switzerland and Italy, writing in near total isolation, mostly ignored. He wasn't writing self-help. He was performing an autopsy on a civilization while it was still walking around pretending to be fine. In 1882, in The Gay Science, he wrote the sentence that made him infamous. Gott ist tot. God is dead. Not a boast, a diagnosis. He was saying that the shared moral foundation that used to tell an entire civilization who to be had quietly dissolved, and almost nobody had noticed the ground was gone yet. Take away the thing that told you why you exist, and the how of your daily life starts to collapse with it. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Nietzsche didn't just describe the emptiness. He described what powerless people do with what's left of their anger. In On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, he named it, a word psychologists still use today, untranslated because there's no clean English equivalent. Ressentiment. He wrote that a revolt in values begins the moment someone denied real power, real agency, turns that denial inward, lets it ferment, and reinvents it as morality. The slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Now hold that against a generation that came of age watching a housing market it can't enter, a job market that ghosts it, and headlines it has zero power to change, on a feed engineered to keep it angry 24 hours a day. What do you do with that much helplessness? You can't fight the system. You can't even reach it. So the anger finds the nearest target it can reach, a stranger's opinion, a stranger's mistake. It feels like power. Nietzsche called it exactly what it is, imaginary revenge dressed up as a value system. That's the mechanism. Not this generation is evil. Ressentiment, industrialized, running on infinite scroll. Here's the part almost nobody covering this topic knows, because it's inconvenient for the heartless generation narrative. In 2011, University of Michigan researcher Sarah Conrath ran a meta-analysis on nearly 14,000 college students across 30 years using a clinical empathy test. the interpersonal reactivity index. She found empathic concern had dropped roughly 40% since the late 1970s, with the steepest decline after the year 2000. That study became the headline every "Kids These Days" article still quotes. But Conrath didn't stop there. In an update tracking the same measure all the way to 2018, published years later, she found something almost nobody reports. Empathy scores started climbing back up after 2009. The generation everyone calls the coldest in history is, by the exact same clinical measurement, showing signs of becoming more capable of empathy than the one before it, not less. So which is it? Are they hollowing out, or are they healing? Nietzsche would say you're asking the wrong question. In Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, he wrote the line everyone quotes and nobody sits with. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. He wasn't talking about villains. He was talking about anyone who spends enough years defending themselves that the defense starts to look, from the outside, like the whole personality. You don't choose to stop feeling. You get worn into it. Here's where most people quoting Nietzsche get him completely backwards. They use him to justify the coldness. Sigma, dominance for its own sake. He never asked for that. Look at what he actually wrote about suffering in Twilight of the Idols, 1888. The line everyone half quotes. Was mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker. What does not kill me makes me stronger. It sits inside a section titled Maxims and Arrows under the header From the War School of Life. Notice the word school. Suffering was only valuable to Nietzsche if it was survived on purpose and turned into something built, not numbed through, not weaponized against a stranger for 5 seconds of dopamine. In Ecce Homo, his own account of his life, he used a phrase he made famous: Werde der du bist. Become who you are, not who your parents needed, not who an algorithm profits from you being. He called this self-authorship amor fati, love of fate, full ownership of your life exactly as it is, with no outsourcing of blame or credit. And 60 years after Nietzsche died, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl walked out of a concentration camp and gave Nietzsche credit for the sentence that got him through it. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. Frankl didn't survive because he felt nothing. He survived because he decided what the suffering meant before it decided it for him. That's the actual dividing line, not who feels less, but who has a reason strong enough to feel through it without being ruled by it. So the next time someone tells you this generation feels nothing, look closer. It's not nothing. It's a generation standing exactly where Nietzsche stood in 1882, in the wreckage of a map that used to tell everyone who to be, deciding, mostly alone, whether to become a monster or become themselves. Nietzsche lost his mind on a street in Turin in 1889 and died in 1900. He never saw the century his ideas would end up explaining. You're living in the part he didn't get to see. Figure out your why. The rest stops being unbearable. If this changed how you see the people around you or yourself, that's the whole point of this channel. This is Lone Pride.